Hi, Diane Dean here. Today I'm going to continue working on a piece that's a commission piece that you see off here to my left. It is going to be a dogwood tree. I'll just tell you a little bit about how this piece was started. I started with the blank canvas, and this is a small version of a canvas with texture on it. So first I do a process on top of the blank canvas with my acrylic gesso. I like the Utrecht brand professional gesso. It's very thick as mud. And I use palette knives. I have palette knives in a lot of different sizes. So I spread the gesso on the canvas, and then I press in different objects. I use wire mesh. I use ribbon. This is actually not window screen, it's a critter guard that you put over your gutters. I have faux finishing rakes. Anything that I think essentially will create a nice texture. Then once that texture has dried, and I'll do some close-ups of this one later, you'll see that there's some circles and the mesh has really created quite a bit of texture in the background. After the texture on the white step dries, I then paint it solid black. You don't see the texture much in the black piece because there's really not much light reflected off of the textural edges. Once I start working on the background, you'll begin to see the texture again. On this piece, in the background, you'll see shades of green and gold. There's different variations. I use my golden fluids and sometimes a little bit of water, and I'm basically doing a combination of wet and wet, which is a watercolor technique, or dry brushing. And as I pull these colors over the texture, see how the texture begins to reveal itself as it catches the edges of the paint. So now that the background was in on this piece, the next step was to use a variety of colors with a straight palette knife. Basically I used white and black, yellow, blue, quinacridone gold. I had them all out on my palette and essentially just pulled with the palette knife in different sections to create the tree image. Now that that's dried overnight, today I'm going to start on the dogwood blooms. So I'll record various stages as I work on this piece, but first I have to change out of my clothes and get into my painting clothes, so I'll be right back. Before I actually start painting, I'll take some close-up shots of this painting that I'm doing for a customer. And in fact, up above you can see the printed out image of the painting. We basically worked together and looked at images of their room, and they liked some of my dogwood tree paintings, but they wanted a little greener background. So we agreed on the colors for the background, and I used Photoshop mostly to achieve that kind of a look, and provided them with the mock-up, and now I'm actually working on the painting. So when you look closely at the painting from this perspective, you can see over on the left the results of the rake that I've pulled through the canvas. That circle there was created by spinning the rake. You can see a lot of grooves and edges, and you can see where I've actually just free-formed with the palette knife in the surface of the gesso to create kind of fan shapes and shapes that might be clouds. You can also see in this section right here the effects of that wire mesh. I've actually kind of pressed in some tree shapes that are really more like a sculpture, but then I'm painting my tree in other spots on the canvas. You can see the palette knife work a little closer, and the way I've got some texture in the bark of the tree, and again that's a result of the palette knife and the quick drying time with the acrylic paints. And up here you can see another one of my faux finishing rakes at use, and I think I have another one up at the top. Yep, there's another one up there. So my next step will be to start putting the blossoms on this tree, and I'll be recording that in a few minutes. I'm actually going to use some of my golden fluid acrylics. I'm going to use the Indian yellow and ultramarine blue, and with those two colors and a slightly damp brush, I'm going to mix so I get mostly green with a little bit of yellow that will become the edges. And you'll see how this works once I get actually started on the flowers. I don't want to see much blue, but I've got some green and some yellow, and I don't mind if it's not mixed real well. I actually will get better results that way. So I'm going to start, get my palette knife nice and clean on the back side, and I'm just going to scoop up a small amount, dip the edge, so I'm ready to start with the first dogwood. Now I'm going to kind of follow the pattern that was in the piece that I had up there. So you can see the way the color sort of rolls off the edge of the palette knife. And that's a little greener than I want. This time I've got a little more yellow. I can kind of play with it. Yeah, that's a little more natural looking. And the whole trick to learning how to use palette knives is to learn how much paint you can get away with on the palette knife without having so much, especially when you paint upward on an easel like I do. You don't want the paint to be sliding off of the canvas. So it takes a little practice to kind of get that balance right. And then there's also differences in the heavy-bodied paints and the fluids. The heavy-body paints stick really well to the canvas, and the fluids slip. So that's why my edges curl up nicely. It's the fluids that are refusing to hold and are kind of letting gravity pull them down. And that just gives my edges that kind of natural rolled up leaf look. And I kind of like them to be uneven and a bit organic. I have to be careful I don't have any little edges hanging off my palette knife. And after I get the blooms on, then I'll go back in and I'll be creating some centers, leaves, some more drips. So I start again with the black, the texture, then the black, then the dry brushing and wet, then the tree parts. Now I'm on the dogwood blooms. So I'm just going to keep going, and I'll probably speed it up a bit so you can see the process. This is my favorite part. It's finished.